for joining wherever you have joined us from, and welcome to the first in the series of 5 webinars, which we will facilitate over the coming months. And this is part of a joint ALNAP and Global Alliance for Urban Crises webinar series, which we've titled, you can see that on the screen below, Towards Stronger Urban Crisis Prevention, Response and Resilience. For those of you who may not know, my name is James Shell. I'm the Secretariat Coordinator for the Global Alliance for Urban Crises. I also work at Impact Initiatives as their Urban and Settlements Program Manager. And together with us today, in addition to me as co-host, is Leah Campbell. Leah.
Hey everyone, I'm Leah from ALNAP. I'm a Senior Research Officer. ALNAP is a network of humanitarian organizations focused on learning, and we're a member of the Global Alliance for Urban Crises. And last year I published some research about this topic, which I'll mention later on. So I'm really excited to be here to discuss this topic with everyone today, and look forward to discussing with you later on in the Q&A.
Thanks, Leah. So over the coming 6 months, we will be hosting a series of 1-hour interactive webinars, which will focus on key issues related to urban crisis prevention, response and resilience. And the topics that we'll cover will relate to profiling, engaging with local authorities and cities, looking at the competencies required to operate in urban areas. We'll look at displacement in urban areas and urban resilience as well. So just before we do kick off, for those who may not be familiar, the Global Alliance is a multidisciplinary and collaborative community practice, and it was launched as part of the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. And the Alliance, it brings together humanitarian and development actors, local authorities, academia, and the private sector. And the intention is to essentially promote best practice, to provide a platform to convene, develop tools, share evidence, and essentially create a community of practice. But for today's webinar, we will be focusing primarily on urban profiling as this first kind of introductory piece.
So with today's webinar, Urban Profiling, How to Start with a Shared Understanding in Urban Contexts, we're going to look at things like the what and why of urban profiling, including why there needs to be a different approach in urban areas, why urban profiling is a useful tool, and why the Global Alliance for Urban Crises prepared this guidance that we're going to present. We'll also have a chance to discuss some best practice in urban profiling from lessons in 2 different contexts, both Syria and Sudan. And then we'll have an opportunity for discussion and to get to some of your questions in the second half of the session. A bit of housekeeping just before we dig into the content. Only ourselves, me and James, and our speakers are going to be speaking live today. So for everyone else, can you please make sure that your microphones remain muted throughout the session? We very much welcome your comments and questions, and you can submit those using the chat function. You can either send them to the entire group, or if you wish, I'll be sharing the Q&A bit, so you can send them in a direct message, particularly if you want to ask a question anonymously. We have a range of questions that we are going to start with that people submitted in advance. So we'll start with those, and then we'll bring in as many of your questions that we can throughout the webinar. Also, to let you know, the webinar is being recorded, and so for any colleagues who weren't able to join today, either because of a technical issue or because of the scheduling, you can let them know that we're going to upload the recording and share it, and that'll be on both the Alliance website and ALNAP's Urban Humanitarian Response portal.
Thanks so much, Leah. And yes, would like to again highlight the fact that this is recorded. So for those, I know there are quite a few people that are unable to join, so we'll make sure that this is shared widely. But as you can see in front of you on the screen, I'd like to introduce you to the 2 speakers we have for today's session. So first, and very soon, is Philip Decourt. Philip is the Deputy Director of UN-Habitat's New York Liaison Office. Philip is also the focal point for UN-Habitat's crisis-related work out of New York. but also Philip was heavily involved in the creation of the Global Alliance in the lead up to and post the World Humanitarian Summit. So can very much speak to this content from a technical profiling perspective and a much broader perspective as well. And also with us today is Dr. Isis Nunes Ferreira. Isis works at JIPS, the Joint IDP Profiling Service, as the head of field support and capacity building. For some background, Isis is an architect and an urbanist with a focus on participatory planning, collaborative approaches in urban areas, and a focus in forced displacement contexts. And that's why we have Isis joining us today. And on a day-to-day basis, which is another reason why we have Isis to join, is she manages a lot of the delivery of JIPS country support programming and advice to stakeholders who are undertaking profiling activities. So without further ado, let's get into the content of the session, and I'd like to first hand over to Philip to share about about the what and the why of urban profiling. So Philip, over to you, and of course let me know forward and back, pause for the slides.
Thanks, James. Hello, everybody. As you can see from this first slide, it does go back to the earthquake response in Haiti in 2010. I mean, it's the origin of the alliance, but it came exactly from just kind of an understanding that we did not fully grasp what was happening in Port-au-Prince. We didn't understand what people were doing when they were being displaced and what their intent was, and as a consequence, a lot of programming, specifically around shelter, led to humanitarian interventions that ultimately had a negative impact in the longer term. But it goes back to kind of this basic idea: we really need to understand the urban crisis context better in order to move forward. Next, James. A number of key elements to that complexity. One, of course, the fact that cities themselves are complex. There's lots of different systems in cities. Everything has value. There are markets. Money plays a big role. Where people are relates to their status. And a good example is electricity, which is a non-traditional humanitarian sector, but we all know if electricity breaks down, how much it impacts a wide range of issues, from water supply to the functioning, of course, of health facilities, being able to produce basic goods such as bread, and it has a wide range of impact. So being able to understand the complexity of cities in all its systems, both physical and soft, I think is a first need. Then the second thing, for those who have worked in urban crisis environments, there are so many more actors at play that have a role, that have an impact on what is happening, and understanding that, I think, is key. And what we, as from the Alliance perspective, are pointing out is the importance of local governments. Again, a non-traditional actor in the humanitarian sphere, but in urban crisis environments, one of the key players, not only because of it's the closest form of government to the people, but also they have an incredible in-depth understanding of the environment, specifically through their technical departments. Three, the diversity of populations. We know that neighborhoods are all different. The compositions are different. We also know that a lot of the times people have different social networks, and those reach back sometimes across regions, and understanding that link between where people are, where they're coming from, the impact it has on their habits, their cultural practices. For those who worked on the Ebola response in the past, the importance of understanding, if you want to communicate and engage communities, is understanding also the social cultural practices is very important. In urban crisis environments, we often have an overlap of different types of crises. We now often work in protracted conflict environments, but underneath often we have the risk of natural hazards and other kinds of problems such as food insecurity, which is often there in informal settlements in cities. And then the last one is extremely important to understand that once we have a crisis, acute vulnerabilities are created, but they come on top of chronic vulnerabilities. And again, people in informal settlements in slums is a good example of having often suffering from chronic vulnerabilities then get overlaid with acute vulnerabilities. And the fact that we should not only look at people directly affected by the current crisis, but understand the broader context and the chronic vulnerabilities that are there in an urban crisis settings. Next, James. For us, and this is the upfront message, which I think is important to keep in mind. It's also why we kind of focused on this urban profiling as an alliance, is the really important need to have a shared understanding across constituencies. With constituencies, we mean exactly from the government actors to the humanitarian actors to the development actors that are often there in a crisis environment, to, of course, grassroots community groups, and built environment professionals. The importance of really understanding, creating a shared understanding as the essence of why we believe urban profiling is important. Now, we've also done this because we've seen over the last years a wide variety of urban profiling exercises and reasons to do so. I mean, as this is very much, of course, for those of you who are urban planners or architects, this is very much rooted in kind of a longer-term tradition of urban planning. But we've also seen it being used specifically, and this is where JIPS has come in collaboration with UN-Habitat, really trying to understand the displacement better. So there has been a lot of focus on IDP profiling in the last 10 years, but now really kind of making sure in an urban context, how does this come together? What we consider critical to all of them, and this is exactly one of the big lessons learned, which we'll talk about a bit later, is to have that shared understanding is how do we collect the data, how do we analyze the data together, how do we pull in knowledge from different parts, and that shared understanding through a collaborative process is one of the key elements. So it's not just about collecting data and having facts and having an evidence base, but making sure it is done through a collaborative process. James? Now, a little bit more on this collaborative process. I think it has to be done really in a way that we are sure that ultimately decisions that we take are relevant. So that's a key aspect of it. Second one, if we shape the process properly, we will be sure that we are tailored to the context. We don't come in with blueprint approaches from elsewhere, but we are able to tailor what we do to the context and the questions at hand. And there again, the local knowledge is extremely important, knowledge not just from municipal departments, but also from communities themselves. And the last one, the collaborative process is key also to make sure that the shared understanding results in ownership, that we believe in the results, that we understand the results coming out of the profiling process, and they're owned by all actors equally. Now for us, the profiling, the data collection, the analysis is not a product in itself. It's really an important step to be able to ultimately coordinate and program differently, so that one does not go without the other. James? Now, in this publication we did an attempt at a definition, and again, this is a living definition. We're just trying to kind of pull together the key elements as we see it. So urban profiling is a collaborative process for collecting and analyzing data on, one, the conditions of an urban area and its neighborhoods, and important that it's also granular, not just the city as a whole, but also understanding the diversity of the neighborhoods, the systems that organize them, and pinpointing the ones that really matter. 3, the needs, vulnerabilities, and capacities of population groups that reside in them. And again, I just point to you that it's not just about the needs, but also understanding the capacities and the assets we find in communities. Next, its results help to prioritize people and places most in need, taking into account both chronic and acute vulnerabilities. And for those who've worked in urban environments, that diversity can be quite big across neighborhoods or from neighborhood to neighborhood. And lastly, as we said, creating a shared understanding of the situation to build a foundation for a more contextualized, coordinated, complementary, and holistic urban response. Quite a mouthful, but we believe that so far it has all the key ingredients in the way we want to qualify urban profiling exercises. Now, the publication also kind of tries to summarize a number of the key elements, focus both on process and methodology. Again, some language and some ideas on the collaborative process, how to ensure locally owned process and results. On the methodology, a bit of a difficult one, but we really believe that it's important to really make sure that we not just look at people, but also at place, and how do we incorporate spatial analysis, understanding, for instance, if you're working in a specific neighborhood, your water supply, electricity often comes from elsewhere, how that connects, how your neighborhood relates to other parts of the city. Access to food is a very good example also. Understanding where people are and why they're there. Keeping people at the center, very much, which often urban planners amongst us tend to forget, too focused on the spatial element, making sure we keep people at the center of what we do. Consider change over time, and this also is an important point, is making sure that we understand that cities are very dynamic, urban environments are very dynamic, and people affected constantly make decisions based on a set of a number of criteria. Access to livelihoods, access to their social networks, the risk of course they run, their security, but also access to education, and understanding how that changes over time and how our own interventions as humanitarians, and now with all the cash, the move to cash, how cash impacts markets. I think it's important to really have that time element to it in the methodology. Not just a snapshot, but really understanding where we're coming from. Cities always have a long history, pointing also to the chronic vulnerability, but also what we likely see the impact of what we do and how the crisis is changing over time. And making sure exactly that we zoom in, but also zoom out, analyze the city as a whole. So a number of key elements that are described in this profiling guidance that might be useful to keep in mind. Again, it's not about putting out a blueprint, just trying to summarize some of the key elements we believe are important when we look at urban profiling experiences. The next slide. Also an attempt in the guidance note to kind of summarize what we believe so far are the key lessons learned out of the variety of experiences that we have seen so far, and I'm sure Isis will be able to speak to some of them. We can't insist enough that process itself should really result in clarity and trust, and very important for us, ultimately also creating some local government ownership, making sure local governments feel they're increasingly in the driving seat, because they also, when the humanitarians exit, are the ones that have to move everything into recovery and again getting the city back and the community back on track for a more sustainable and more resilient future. So that local government ownership, but a trust element ultimately would then be extremely beneficial, of course, when we start looking at when we are responding to the neighborhoods, to the crisis at hand. Two, an important statement also to make sure that we don't just collect data for the sake of data, but we really kind of are clear about the questions we need to answer now. What do we need to know now in order to respond tomorrow? So that kind of gradual incremental approach to data and analysis, we believe the good enough approach is key to urban profiling. We've seen in a number of protected crisis settings, and I'll just bring Mosul in Iraq, where we started urban profiling at the moment of acute crisis, and then gradually this has developed into a robust data platform for analysis and driving now the recovery and the return in Mosul. So the idea of a good enough approach, I think, is central to what we believe we've seen so far from all the experiences out there. Three, we've talked about the importance of the holistic analysis, including people and places, but understanding that that's not always an easy exercise. Integrating sectoral kind of data analysis putting them into context requires sometimes specific expertise and capacity to do so. So a lesson learned, but not an easy one to actually do properly in practice. And for adapting methods to the nature and stage of crisis, evidently, as we talked before, understanding that we have a wide variety of contexts out there, and important to make sure that we are tailoring what we do, both in process and methodology, to the specific context and the specific moment in a crisis we are looking at. So I'll leave it to that, just to kind of set out the main elements of the guidance note, and back over to you, James.
Thanks so much, Philip, for those comments and your intervention. Now, just bear with me, everyone, while I do some changing on the screen, and take the opportunity now to introduce you all to Isis, who will take the next series of slides. So hopefully you can see in front of you. And Isis, if you can hear me, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction, James, Leah, and Philippe. I'm Isis Núñez Ferreira, and I'm going to be showing you two cases to basically explore how urban profiling looks in practice. Next, James. I decided to show you two case studies just to see how urban profiling takes different shapes according to the characteristics of the context. The first case study that I'm going to present is based in North Darfur in Sudan, very much a protracted displacement situation, very much linked to rapid urbanization, particularly of medium-scale towns or cities, and linked to also environmental challenges in the region, but with a specific focus on durable solutions, already planning for durable solutions for the displaced populations living in the urban areas. The second case study, though, is linked more, of course, to the conflict in Syria. So you can imagine a context with heavily damaged cities, each of them very different from each other, widespread displacement, sometimes intra-urban displacement as well, and a lot of methodological challenges. Limited access to population is one good example, but overall with a focus on how to transition to a sustainable and inclusive recovery and reconstruction. Next. So when we focus on El Fasher in North Darfur, why was urban profiling needed here? Darfur is hosting right now 1.8 million IDPs, the majority of them very much living in camps that now resemble permanent settlements. Some of the towns and cities hosting these camps are also rapidly urbanizing and have been so for the last 15 years. And some of that urbanization is linked to the conflict-induced displacement, but also to drought and desertification. So a lot of very complex and interesting dynamics coming into place affecting the urban area. At the same time, there is at this point, when we started this exercise, there was very little data giving us an accurate picture of IDPs, their plans for the future, and the challenges that they might face to achieve those. And this was important, specifically at a time where both the government and the international community were focused on durable solutions already. And what did I mean? That they had to think on long-term planning and very much understand what that humanitarian development nexus that we talk about so much actually looks in practice. Next. So who was involved and in what role? I wanted to show you this graphic for you to see the extent of the collaboration in this exercise. From our side, none of these case studies that I'm presenting here are actually ours. They are not JIPS. They're actually implemented by a wide range of stakeholders. And JIPS' role is basically providing technical support in terms of the technical aspects, but also on the collaboration. The interesting thing here is that the collaboration involved different levels of government at federal and local level. It also involved different UN agencies and NGOs working both on humanitarian response, but also development planning. And each of these actors had a specific role in the process, whether it was for decision-making or as part of the steering committee, or for technical aspects such as the data collection, the urban analysis, and so on. Last and not least, the communities from the IDP camps were also involved in the process, particularly by self-organizing and being involved in the data collection. Next. So you heard Philippe talking a lot about bringing people and places together. How does that actually happen in practice, and how do we develop a methodology that addresses that? It's not always an easy task. In the case of Nord Darfur, in the case of El Fasher, we had, of course, people at the center looking at IDPs, their displacement history, their current conditions and intentions. But at the same time, we used a comparative approach. We looked at their conditions, but also the ones of the host communities, particularly those living in the peri-urban and urban areas. At the same time, we utilize a sampling approach that look at by population groups, but also by the place that they were inhabiting. You see there in the map where these population groups were settled, and we realized that the host communities living in urban and peri-urban were facing very different living conditions. And the third element that basically brought this together was an urban analysis that was implemented by a group of the partners to try to understand the context where these displacement challenges are being faced. Next. Part of the, for example, as an example of how different partners take different roles, but also on how we promote a locally owned process, UN-Habitat, we capitalize on the relationship that UN-Habitat had already with the Ministry of Urban Planning. And between the two organizations, they developed the urban analysis. And it was important to understand, particularly the urban development challenges that were related to the displacement situation, especially when the Ministry of Urban Planning was the one in charge of service provision and also on the extension plans of the city. At the same time, this exercise involved a capacity needs assessment. And this was crucial to understand what is the capacity the Ministry of Urban Planning had to actually make the results of this urban profiling actionable. So these two approaches, partnering and capitalizing on the expertise of local authorities, but also understanding their capacity in relation of not only being part of the urban profiling, but also utilizing the results in the future, it's something that we promoted through this particular urban profiling in Sudan. Next. At the same time, you heard also from Philippe quite a lot of emphasis on collaboration. And you also saw the graphic that I show you with all the stakeholders involved in this process. I wanted to show you these pictures just to show you how collaboration takes very different shapes and forms within an urban profiling process. And we as practitioners involved in this type of processes need to be able to utilize tools that allow stakeholders to get involved in different aspects, whether this is data collection, whether this is joint analysis or participatory analysis, or whether this is the development of the recommendations. So my main message here is that yes, it's important to establish that collaboration from the inception, but the most critical part is to make that collaboration sustainable throughout. And for that, we require certain approaches and certain tools that allow stakeholders to be fully included in this process. Next. So what does it produce and how it can be used? I wanted to show you just a couple of examples. First of all, the urban profiling in El Fasher provided comparative results, but not only by population, but also by area. By population, it was critical because it allowed us to understand which IDP vulnerabilities are linked to the displacement status, particularly in areas where urban poverty was widespread and where IDPs were sharing many of the vulnerabilities with the urban poor, particularly those host communities living in the peri-urban area. At the same time, the results by area were extremely useful or are useful, particularly for the Ministry of Urban Planning that are in charge of thinking on how the city will expand in the immediate and the long-term future as well. At the same time, it provided evidence on how IDPs are progressing or not towards solutions, but not only in the physical sense of return to their villages, local integration or relocation, but also across different areas that are related to solutions, such as access to documentation, long-term safety and security. James, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, I can't see the slides anymore.
It looks as though James might have lost connection, so we might have to carry on until he's able to reconnect without a video. Or
I can share also my slides. I have them.
yes, try.
If that helps.
Yeah, try doing that, and we'll see.
Can you all see my screen?
Yes. If you could put it into the presentation mode so it's a bit bigger, perfect.
Perfect. Apologies for that. If you can all see, I can continue. So yes, I was discussing how it also produces evidence across different aspects of solutions, and what that makes possible is for actually joint programming to happen, because it speaks towards the mandates and the response that different agencies, whether government or UN or NGOs, are actually related to. And lastly, but not last but not least, it also provides, through the urban analysis, it provides spatial and environmental considerations for interim solutions, especially for those populations that want to return but cannot do so in the immediate future, but also long-term integration for those that wish to remain and that have already plans to integrate into El Fasher. So this was the summary of the first case study. The second case study relates to the urban analysis network of Syria, so it relates to Syrian cities. Why was urban profiling needed in Syrian cities? Well, as you can imagine, the Syrian crisis is profoundly urban, and each city is very much distinct from each other and complex in themselves. However, at the same time, there is scarce information, specifically for neighborhood response plans and city-level strategies, and this comes at a time when there is an increasing need to transition to sustainable and inclusive recovery. However, even if there is the good intention to make urban profiling possible in these areas, we also know that we face many methodological challenges, such as the widespread damage, but sometimes not necessarily having access to assess that properly, as well as displacement, including intra-urban. And this in a context where we have minimal access to populations, but also restrictions on data collection methods. So in this very complex context, of course, not one organization or agency can do an assessment by itself, and particularly an urban profiling by itself. This is why this project involve a consortium of partners with complementary expertise. Some of them focus on conflict analysis, others focus on the displacement aspect. And from the European Commission, the Joint Research Center bringing their expertise on remote sensing analysis, and then the information management focus from IMAP. This is a rather complex diagram, but I wanted to show you how we wanted to really make this whole discourse around bringing people and places together into reality and into an analytical framework that is very much rooted in the urban recovery framework that is created for Syria at the moment. And the emphasis we put here is into trying to understand the gaps between what the city is able to provide to the populations at this moment in time. So to understand that snapshot of what is the capacity of the city, not only related to services, but also in terms of governance, local economy, social cohesion, and then related also to housing, land, and property. On the other hand, the arrows that you see from the bottom relates to understanding what the population is able to access? What are their perceptions in terms of the quality and reliability of what they receive at the moment? So the snapshot basically allows you to understand the gap between those two things, what the city is able to offer and then what the population is actually getting. And as an umbrella, bringing together this is the context analysis, an extremely important aspect to consider, specifically in this context in Syria, that looking at pre-conflict urban trends, the scale of the conflict, and the scale of the displacement. So what does it produce and how it can be used? I think here you will see how a lot of the things that Philippe was discussing in terms of services, zooming in and zooming out at neighborhood level, but also zooming in into neighborhood level, but also zooming out at city level, actually materializes. Some of the results that this process produces are at sectoral level, but also intersectoral, and also at neighborhood and city level. And this brings together data from communities themselves, particularly on access, reliability, and quality of services, but also data from local sector experts and key informants, which is extremely important to tap into that local knowledge. At the same time, it brings data from context analysis, as I mentioned before, and then remote sensing and asset surveys or asset mapping across the city and by neighborhood. And I want to show you that little table that I outlined there, showing you how this index that we have created, bringing people and infrastructure together, allows you to see which issues are widespread across the city, but also which neighborhoods are most affected and where some of these issues perhaps are more acute. So it gives you a picture at the neighborhood level, but also at the city level. And what we come up with at the end is information that allows us to understand which neighborhoods are still in need of relief-oriented response, perhaps those where the most vulnerable populations are concentrating in, and which neighborhoods are already ready for a recovery-oriented response, those that perhaps can receive more returns, for example, and that efforts can be dedicated to already think on reconstruction. So what we're trying to do here is to bring the population and the services together and to try to give results to different types of stakeholders so they can do joint programming for recovery, but also for relief in the cases where this is still needed. Looking at results, but perhaps at a higher level, I just want to show you how by overlaying some of these remote sensing analyses, some of the context analysis, and some of the look at the population data and estimates, we can also start seeing some of the trends in terms of return. On your left side, you can see Raqqa. On your right side, you can see Deir ez-Zor. In Raqqa, for example, you can see the damage cloud. There's widespread damage. However, there is actually a quite spontaneous return happening, not necessarily guided by planning instruments or specific restrictions. It's happening in a more spontaneous way and very much people-driven. And what we found when looking at the density change in each of the neighborhoods is that no neighborhood is actually abandoned at this point, even when some of them are completely destroyed. But it's a basically people-driven process. While in Deir ez-Zor, there are more instruments applied at the moment that are restricting which areas returns can happen and which not. So I guess it's trying to look at more long-term planning and development. So return is happening as well, but then we have big areas, specifically the ones related to economic recovery, that are not being populated at the moment, or activities are not being activated as well. So this type of overlaying, looking at these type of trends, can actually be helpful to inform policy development on return and reconstruction in the future. Lastly, some of these results, this is Deir ez-Zor, are being utilized by the joint program composed by five UN agencies, trying to transform the urban profiling recommendations into more sectoral project packages and joint programming. So none of the organizations part of the consortium are inside Syria, of course, but we hope that with these type of snapshots and city profiles, that these products can be useful for stakeholders that are already operational in the country, and that they can transform these recommendations into actual joint programming as well. And just to finalize here, this urban profiling methodology is building on years of work from UN-Habitat, specifically in the region on city profiles. So we took this knowledge from this and adapted to be able to address the challenges, specifically on the lack of access to populations in the area. Just to finalize, I offer here some reflections, and maybe this can encourage a bit of the discussion later on. First of all, urban profiling effectively informs joint action when it involves all the relevant stakeholders from its inception, but especially throughout the process, and specific tools are needed to sustain that. Second, flexible and mixed methods approach is essential to adapt to urban profiling to the context, the type of crisis, and the time of the response. And the input of the relevant stakeholders and tapping into local knowledge for this is essential. And I think the two case studies that I show you basically spoke to these points very well. Third, the analysis of people and places needs to be linked to identify planning processes and recovery frameworks. If we're going to embark on an urban profiling process, it cannot be disconnected from what is already planned for the area, the city, or the region. It ideally should be linked to this, so it can be actually used for also for long-term planning and be part of that vision that the stakeholders are already thinking. Fourth, comparisons between population groups is critical, particularly in urban areas where different population groups, displaced and urban poor, are living together in similar conditions. You saw in the case of Darfur, of North Darfur, where we utilized that approach in order to understand which vulnerabilities were specific to the IDPs and which ones were shared across the urban poor in the city. And lastly, but an actually very important point that we have learned from different urban profilings is that we talk about collaboration, but this collaboration needs to go beyond the usual government, humanitarian, and development stakeholders. Communities themselves, both displaced and hosts, are not involved sufficiently in key discussions and decisions in urban profiling. And we need more of this, but we also need more examples on how this actually happens. How do we address not only the methodological challenges, but also the political challenges of engaging more the displaced and host communities in this process? And that is all from my side. Thank you very much. I'm happy to hear any doubts or questions you have. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, both Philippe and Isis, for that. And happy to say James is back with us as well. So we'll jump straight into the Q&A because we've only got 10 or 15 minutes left. And I'll turn to Philippe first to give Isis a second to catch her breath. The first question that was submitted in advance from a colleague is around the kind of value add or necessity of doing this sorts of analysis exercise. Given all the other things that we might spend our time and financial resource doing, is it worth it to put the time and effort into doing this sort of analysis? Aren't we already supposed to understand the context in which we work? Do we really need to be doing this sort of thing? So that's the first question that we have. Over to you, Philippe.
Thanks, Leah, for that. I think, of course, I mean, my answer is yes. I do think it's important, one, to really make sure that we really understand the city in all its complexities, both in terms of the systems, but also the communities and the neighborhoods. So we are able to have a granular approach because one neighborhood, one community is not the same as the next one. Understanding the bigger picture is equally important. Two, what we pointed out in terms of that shared understanding. I think too often we focus on what we do ourselves, but the profiling really allows to kind of create a shared understanding and a partnership across the constituencies, in particular with the local actors, and being able to pull in that local knowledge, I think, is critical. And three, and pointing out that yes, we should be careful not to get into too complex and too cumbersome kind of processes, but make sure that we really are articulating the kind of questions we need to answer at that moment in time, and allowing it to evolve as we move forward. So not a one-off type of exercise, but a kind of the good enough approach, I think, is critical to do this properly and to make sure the time and resources invested are well used. Back to you, Leah.
Great, thanks, Philippe. And I would add from my own research, although we are supposed to be understanding the context in which we work, this is one area where if you look at humanitarian evaluations that we're consistently not good at. So I think this is not just an urban problem, but as with many things, the kind of scale and complexity of urban shines a light on something that we should be getting better at in all sorts of contexts. And I know JIPS does their profiling both in urban and rural or kind of more spread out areas. I don't know, Isis, if you have any further thoughts on this one you want to add about why organizations who come to JIPS are prepared to put their time and energy into this sorts of process. What's the value add for them?
Thank you, Leah. I think from our experience, where we basically find ourselves trying to facilitate agreement and trust in data processes across very different types of stakeholders. Yes, sometimes we can think, is this worth it? But I can say from our experience that it is definitely worth it, not because of the sake of collaboration, but actually because what we find is that if you concentrate on creating evidence by yourself that is only useful for your own programs, but also related to others, if you want to already think on long-term planning or even thinking on durable solutions and thinking that whatever evidence you create by yourself will be accepted by that government you're trying to work with, whether it's local or national, that in practice is very difficult to achieve. And why is that? Because when people do not engage in the data that is informing the response, they are more likely to not trust it actually, or is easily more contestable. So this is why we really put that effort to make sure that from the beginning, everyone agrees on the objectives, everyone agrees on what needs to be measured, everyone agrees on the areas that need to be studied or explored. And basically that everyone is informed throughout the process. At the end of it, it's very, very unlikely that they will see the final result and say, this doesn't apply to me, I don't trust this data is inconsistent or it's inaccurate. It will be much more unlikely, particularly because they have been involved in the process and they have agreed at different steps of the processes. I think we have supported around a bit more than 100 exercises with this type of methodology. And of course, it's not easy to achieve in each of the cases, but it has shown consistently that at the end of the process, the trust and the agreement built, especially around the evidence, is important. And in cities, it's even more important because the complexity of the stakeholders that need to be involved is even larger than when you're looking, for example, just at camp settings.
Great, thanks. We've had another question come in, and it relates to one we had on the list of advanced questions as well, around the possibilities for actual community engagement in activities like this. So, Isis, you mentioned that this is an area of potential improvement. Do either of you have any suggestions about actual ways that communities themselves could be more involved in analysis exercises like this?
If I can respond to here. So we have been investing quite a lot on trying to develop the tools that allow us to engage more communities. And I mean, when I say meaningful engagement, is that we involve communities and they understand what the process that they're getting into. They're not just answering the question the way that they think that we want to hear. So especially in analysis processes, in validation processes, you need to try to make them familiar with the content that you are providing or that you want to discuss and so on. So I worked before in mostly with the participatory slum upgrading, for example. But this is very different when we talk about crisis, and when we talk about displacement, it brings an even more complex political aspect to it as well. If you, for example, in the case of North Darfur in Sudan, communities were very much involved in the data collection. They were involved in the development of the indicators. However, when it came to validation, it became a much more sensitive process. Why? Because that's linked to the solutions that they seek, and that's linked also to what the other partners are thinking of solutions. So from my side, I think we need more examples. We need to look at community engagement in urban crisis a bit. We need to look at it a bit more in depth and share examples of how this had worked in other contexts, and try to apply those lessons into urban crisis, particularly from our side when we talk about urban displacement specifically, that can be very, very political. But just as an example from our work in Honduras, where we are looking at urban violence and generalized violence, where engaging communities can be actually dangerous for them and for the facilitators. In this case, we partnered with World Vision that had a team of social workers, some of them actually part of those communities that had access to them. So I think this is an important, maybe related to the question we had before, why it's important to actually partner and work together with different stakeholders. It's also to capitalize on their knowledge, but also on the connections they have, in this case, to the communities that are difficult to reach.
Hi, Lil. Just 2 quick points from my side. This is Philip. I think that's why ICES referred to mixed methods. I think it's important to keep it in mind. I mean, in the case of Syria, we've done a lot of very targeted focus group discussions, bringing some key community leaders and others around the table. We've developed tools ourselves that allow people in informal communities to collect their own data on their kind of land tenure situation, their rights to the land and the properties they occupy. So it's important to look at mixed methods and not just kind of apply the traditional tools we have. Over to you, Leah.
Great, thanks. I'm going to take the opportunity of co-chair to answer one of the questions directly myself, and then go back to you two. Someone's asked for a definition of what would be comprised within context analysis, and I just wanted to share the one from the paper that I mentioned that I'd worked on last year, which we'll put up at the end of the webinar for anyone who'd like to have a look. So the first step is to kind of remind ourselves what context is, and I would define it as the environment and circumstances within which something happens and which can help explain it. And so it's important to think and realize that the context of a place is separate from any kind of crisis or situation that might be happening. It existed long before and will continue on, and it includes things like the economy, the politics, the social and cultural dimensions, the stakeholder dynamics, the services, and the space and settlements there. And so context analysis is another term like profiling, and we could have a lengthy discussion to what extent they're similar and different, but I'd say they're both related tools in that profiling helps us understand the context, as would context analysis. Often context analysis doesn't include the elements of profiling that look at the scale of the displacement. So profiling is kind of a mixture of the context sort of information, the social cultural issues, the politics, the stakeholders, as well as understanding the scale of a displacement, particularly in the examples that were shared today. 2 questions that have come in that I'm going to hand over to Philippe and Isis to answer relate to the time frame for these activities. So on a practical scale, somebody asked how long the specific examples that you've shared, Isis, took, and I guess overall how long the exercises JIPS supports usually takes. And then as a related question, because I know partly the answer to that is quite a bit of time, is this a tool that can be used in a number of different humanitarian contexts? Is it something that can just be used in more protracted, or even some might call them moving towards development contexts, or is this a sort of tool that could apply to a wide variety of different sort of humanitarian contexts and timeframes? I'll start with Isis and then we'll go to Philippe. Isis, can you hear me?
Oh, sorry, I was in mute. Apologies.
Okay.
Yes, so I can talk, for example, for the two cases that I presented. They're quite different from each other in terms of timeframes. In the case of Syria, we're not doing household surveys, for example. It's more through key informants and community focal points. This is a 2 years project looking at 21 different cities. So it's a massive task. And in this case, the collaborative approach is not happening on the ground in the sense that we undertake a batch of data collection for 10 cities, and then the analysis is the one that involves different experts to basically give their interpretation as well of how these different layers of data are coming up. So in this case, it's a 2 years project looking at producing 21 different city profiles. In the case of Sudan, that included this larger collaboration and very much promoting that locally owned process, engaging the Ministry of Urban Planning and many other stakeholders on the ground. This took a bit more than maybe 18 months, more or less. But this was a very, very large exercise where also the World Bank was also heavily involved in terms of technically involved. So this took around 18 months. In other cases, I can say it can take up to from 6 months to 15 months, more or less. It depends on if we're looking at the city level, if we're looking at different cities in a specific region, and so on. And it also depends on the type of collaboration that we're trying to achieve. The more that we're trying to engage, of course, the more that it will take, and also depends on the political situation. What we find in some of these contexts is that some of these processes get delayed because of political instability, because of the change of government. In these cases, we have to build that collaboration again, rebuild that collaboration and that trust with governments, which is what happened actually in Sudan and why this process took a bit longer. The government changed. The government in North Darfur changed, I think, twice while we were doing the process. So we saw important to actually put some effort and time in rebuilding that trust.
Hello, just adding one point. I think it's important to note that this is not stopping kind of sectoral assessments that are ongoing. It is important to find ways to, as we do the urban profiling exercise, we're able to integrate results of sectoral analysis. So I think just that's important to understand. This is not something that everything has to wait for. This is something that allows to integrate different analysis processes also as we move forward. Over.
Great, thanks to you both. And on the timeline point, I would again refer back to the paper, which I'll mention in a second, that I looked at, because there are a number of different sorts of tools. Well, and while they're not profiling, there are other sorts of context sort of tools which can be done in a much shorter time frame if that's required in the context. So we've had to come to the end of the webinar, unfortunately, and we appreciate you all sticking with us and appreciate we've already gone a few minutes over time. We wanted to note a few kind of highlights from the discussion today. We talked about the importance of sharing a shared understanding across all constituencies, all actors involved, with local ownership and emphasizing a collaborative process. Philippe also mentioned the importance of integrating sectoral data with an understanding of people's needs and assets, with kind of the concept of place and their urban environment they're living in, and and the importance of a good enough approach, focusing on information that we really actually need to respond better. Isis talked us through the two different examples and emphasized that profiling can't be an efficient investment if it's just used as a kind of self-serving tool, and that came up in the Q&A as well. That profiling, if it's going to be successful, needs to be joint and coordinated with as many actors involved in the response as possible from the inception. And again, that's something that came out as a strong point from my own research as well. Isis also talked about the need to be flexible when you're doing profiling, to adapt any existing approaches or toolkits to the actual context you're working in, relevant to the specific crisis and time frame you have available. She also talked about the importance of linking an analysis of people and places to planning processes and recovery frameworks that already might exist. The importance of comparing population groups, particularly in urban areas where different population groups, such as the displaced or the urban poor, might be living together in very close proximity, but having very different circumstances and experiences there. And finally, the importance of going beyond typical kind of interlocutors and stakeholders and really engaging communities, both displaced and host communities, to be involved in key discussions. So thanks again to both of our speakers for those presentations. I'd like to point out that all of the things we've discussed today are reflected in two pieces of literature that will pop up on the screen for you all. One of them is the Global Alliance Knowledge Product on Urban Profiling, which was just released at the end of last year, and there's a screenshot there, which is freely available on the Global Alliance Resource Library, and we'll also aim to send out the links to both of these to everyone who participated today when we send out the recordings, so you can easily access them. The second publication is the study I've mentioned that ALNAP published called What's Missing? Adding Context to the Urban Toolbox, and that should pop up on the screen for you as well, which looks quite in depth at both profiling and other sorts of tools which can help us understand the urban context, as I mentioned, and it has an accompanying annex which looks at about 25 different tools, including specifically the UN-Habitat city profiles discussed here today, as well as various other ones. So that's all from me. I'll pass over to James. Thank you all very much for sharing your time today. James will take it away and tell you what's coming up next.
Thanks so much, Leo, Isis, and Philippe, and again, apologies for the connection drop off on my side. But just to move forward and to bring to an end, what you can see on the screen in front of you is 4 complementary products recently developed by the Alliance that are part of the series of the Global Alliance various knowledge products. And today we obviously spoke about the profiling, and in future webinars we will be touching on other key issues as mentioned before: engagement with local authorities, expertise, urban displacement, and resilience. And why these are in front of you here is to highlight that there is a knowledge base that we'll be building off in the future webinars. And the very last point is to share with you that next month, on Thursday, the 18th of July, we'll be holding our next webinar. And again, this will be focused more so on strengthening engagements and partnerships at the city level, and with a predominant focus on international humanitarian and development actors and their experience, their engagement with local authorities. So that's what we'll deep dive into in the next webinar. Very briefly, and we'll share this out after, we'll put in the ways for you to register for that. But we're 10 minutes late, so on that note, I'd just like to thank you all for joining us today. Again, I apologise for the technical issues before. What I'm going to do right now is to put in a link for you to complete a short survey to strengthen our future webinars. And obviously one might be a larger room, but any other suggestions that you have, and if that's related to length, if that's related to structure, and even more so if that's related to content. If there's something that we have not discussed or will not discuss in the future webinars that you think is really important, please tell us, because we'll discuss it. So I'm just going to put this in the chat box right now and encourage you to just spend 2 minutes of your time maximum on that. And on that note, 10 minutes past the hour. I really appreciate you all for joining, Isis, Philippe, and for Leah in co-hosting. And I wish you all a fantastic afternoon or evening or rest of morning. So thank you all.